it's a joke. I mean, I don't know what they mean by critical.
Right.
They think critical means against. But of course, there's a great tradition of critical philosophy from Kant that emerges as critical theory in the 20th century. And the question of critique is, of course, a huge one for many people who work in social theory and literary theory. So I do defend the notion of critique, as do many others. I don't see it as purely negative.
But this, I think, allows us to come to the last part that I had in mind, and that we can then maybe wrap it up, but to come back to this phantasmatic theme of gender, this phantasm of gender that which we started.
Yeah.
That is your current interest, not in defending a theory of gender, but trying to understand the mechanism of which this phantasm is created, amplified, and generating mechanism of projection that are very effective. That are contagious and mimetic in that sense, spread from self to other. And so I was wondering if you could come back to the efficacy of the construction of that phantasm, not only within neo-fascist leaders that you discuss, that kind of the most visible and, let's say, scary dimension. And I fundamentally share it because I've written a book on neo-fascism.
Yes.
And I'm worried about it.
Okay. What's the title of your book?
New Fascist.
New Fascist?
Okay. New in bracket, because maybe it's not.
Maybe, I know, that's the question.
Right.
I'd like to read your book. I don't know what language it's in, but...
Good, but what is also troubling is the fact that one doesn't need to be a fascist or non-fascist or a Catholic fundamentalist in order to embrace
that's right.
that phobic ideology.
Yes.
So how do you account for this success of the phantom on the side of feminism
Well,
in England?
look, some feminists have deep fears about trans women in particular, but let's remember that the right-wing forces, more broadly, who are fighting gender or calling it gender ideology, are also against feminism. So the feminists who are opposing trans rights should actually be in alliance, because our true enemy is a right wing that is increasingly fascist and authoritarian. So in a way, my book calls for a broader alliance without complete agreement.
Yeah.
I hope they take me up on it, but I don't think they're doing that. Okay. I think that there are two issues. Well, first, just let me say, I know there are many debates about fascism, and perhaps you've addressed them in your book, which I hope to read. But I try to talk about fascist trends, so kind of fascist movements or even fascist fantasies. And I became aware of the anti-gender ideology movement in South America, and in particularly in Brazil, but also in Argentina, in Mexico, in Colombia during their elections several years ago. And there I saw that people had a lot of fear about their lives, like the future of their families, the future of their work. Neoliberal politics and economics had pervaded so many of these countries, and they were afraid that the social democratic dimension of their lives, the basic goods that they had come to expect, like education and healthcare, were being taken away, or that jobs were becoming more precarious, short-term contracts, unions were being destroyed or weakened. And they also, I think, felt the changes in the environment and not knowing what the future holds. So people do have a lot of fear. They have fear about the future. And almost all the young people I know have deep fear about the future. And some just say there is no future, especially now with these open-ended wars. Now, if an authoritarian, a populist, comes into your public media and says, I can restore you to a time when everything was secure, when your family was secure, men were men, women were women, your children are heterosexual, they all get married. The church has its place in your life, your work is secure, you belong to a community, there are no migrants. That fantasy, it's a restoration fantasy, is one in which migrants are excluded, trans people, feminism is defeated, socialism and communism are defeated, and a certain kind of capitalism works in conjunction with a strengthened church, increasingly powerful when it comes to matters of reproductive care, sexuality and gender, education. So, on the one hand, there is an existing fear. But if you're told gender is what's making you afraid, it's going to destroy your family, it's going to destroy humanity, it's going to destroy everything you care about most. Or migrants, they are the ones who are destroying your life. You won't be thinking about capitalism, you won't be thinking about extractivism, you won't be thinking about systemic racism or war. You'll be thinking about migrants, racial difference, you'll be thinking about sexuality, gender, wokeism, whatever it is called. And they will become the enemies. And if you get rid of them, especially if they are understood as the devil, as demonic forces that will harm your children, you will get rid of them in the hopes that your life will be restored to that basic order. So, and then of course, gender is so intimate. Like if Meloni or Putin or Orban say, oh, gender, it will strip you of your sexed identity. You won't be a man anymore, and you won't be a father. You won't be a woman anymore. You won't be a mother. Then people are made afraid at a very intimate level of their lives. I mean, these are, of course, false claims, but they're incendiary, and they are meant to inflame fear and to induce people to put trust in these authorities who will amplify state powers at the expense of democracy and will promise a security, a fantasy of return to a time that never was. So I think that that's one way in which these strategies work.
Yeah, they're very effective, especially when there are real dangers and people are struggling in terms of migration and climate catastrophes, and there are a number of problems. So it's spread contagiously, and it affects what I call Homo Mimeticus. It's not the rational part of the self that is affected by it, but fear operates in by a scapegoating mechanism as well, when it becomes easy to point to marginalized others. You reclaim the concept of gender critical for your work, right?
Well, it's a joke. I mean, I don't know what they mean by critical.
Right.
They think critical means against. But of course, there's a great tradition of critical philosophy from Kant that emerges as critical theory in the 20th century. And the question of critique is, of course, a huge one for many people who were in social theory and lit theory. So I do defend the notion of critique, as do many others. I don't see it as purely negative. So critical philosophy was, at least in Kant, certainly a critique of positivism. And unfortunately, most of the trans exclusionary feminists who call themselves gender critical are returning to positivism. They think that sex is an observable fact, and only somebody blinded by ideology or psychosis would deny such a thing. And of course, sex does exist, there's no question about it, but it's always framed. And they are also framing it when they put it in the positivist frame. But positivism denies the frame. So we need to be critical about what they're doing. So a critical philosophy of gender, yeah, that sounds good. A critical theory of gender, that sounds good. That means we would ask about its conditions of possibilities, the limits of what we can know.
Well, in the sphere of politics, I mean, we were talking before about the polarization. It's difficult to speak across differences, and you mentioned that your first book was on Hegel, Subject of Desire.
Yes.
You're a natural-born dialectical thinker.
I guess, but I also get very frustrated with dialectics.
But in this dialectics between the anti-gender ideology movement and trans movement, which advocate purely legitimate freedoms, I was wondering, the question of strategy on the number of issues, because in your book you talk about gender, but you also talk about the air we breathe and climate catastrophes and migrations and the plurality challenges and crises that are affecting us. And so I was wondering on the strategies within critique, on the topics to foreground. It seems that for the fascists they can mobilize easy weapons against the transgender, and so I'm thinking of Spivak's notion of strategic essentialism.
Yeah, she rejected that though. Yeah. She came to reject that.
Yes. But strategy.
Yeah, I have a strategy. Build a bigger, larger alliance, bigger, larger transnational alliance. But don't give up on any of the issues. Don't foreground some and background others. No.
You don't think?
No.
Strategically,
no. The best possible strategy is a very powerful national alliance that becomes irresistible in what it imagines and what it stands for. The only way to end this war in Gaza. It's the only way to end what's happening in Ukraine and to save the planet. So, yeah, that's what I want.
The reason I asked the question is because we all know, I think, people who are not necessarily fascist or Catholic who struggle.
Yes, of course they do.
Yeah.
And we need to reach out to those people.
How to reach those people.
I think it's very important. I give interviews to Christian Magazine, and they're some of the most thoughtful interviewers that I have met. So, and within the Christian church, various churches, there are people on different sides, and a lot of open questioning, because we're talking about their children and their cousins. And I think we need to, as academics, we need to speak more publicly. We need to make our positions known, but also listen to the concerns that people have. And my book, Who's Afraid of Gender, I wrote it really for the people who were having doubts in their mind. So it wasn't, I didn't write it to change the point of view of the hard right. And anybody who already agrees with me is not going to learn a lot that's new, maybe some. But it's the people in the middle who don't know how to think about some of these issues and are maybe disturbed. I think that's legitimate. They need to be heard, and I think the more we can speak with them, the better.
Thanks so much for speaking publicly.
Thank you.
And taking so much time.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming.
You know, absolutely. I
Okay.
mean, come on, I would never have missed this. Super, merci. And so I thought, well, you know, it's such an old and ancient concept. It starts with Plato and Aristotle, and I'm going to need some help to shift the balance from representation and realism and sameness towards difference and protean transformation. And so, of course, I had you on my list, and so I was incredibly happy when you said that you'd be in Paris and I'd be willing to do that.
Great.
And also a confession. I mean, it takes a little bit of courage to reach out to influential people.
Yes, I'm sorry that's true, because we're just regular people.
Absolutely, but also very, very busy. And I remember retrospectively that we had met at the University of Washington in 2004, like 20 years ago. Long time ago. Don't expect you to remember, but I was an MA student then, working on Eric Garay and Richard Rodriguez, French correction.
But it makes sense, right? Because his account of assimilation depends on mimesis to some degree.
Yeah. And he was kind of irritating me because he was arguing for the total assimilation.
Yes, I think I actually... Well, you are one of a few people who have expressed irritation with his position.
Right.
And that was happening about 20 years ago.
Yes, a while back.
I do remember there were people in Irvine who were also very angry about that. Yeah.
And so, retrospectively, I thought, well, this actually was an important moment because in my thinking when I was reaching out to Jean-Luc Nancy and Morin, Caballero, I already met somebody influential early on.
Yeah.
So basically, you come last of this series.
But maybe I'm first. Okay.
You've been first.